You were never supposed to hear this. The story of Lady Seraphina Vance was whispered only in candlelit corners, carried in fragments by servants who swore their silence, and buried by men who feared what her name alone could stir. They called her a widow, a temptress, a curse. But the truth is far more venomous. It begins not with love, nor with loss, but with a funeral where the soil covered not only a coffin, but an empire of control, fear, and corruption. Imagine England in the 1860s. Fog swallowing cobblestone streets, the smell of damp earth clinging to wool coats, and a society rotting beneath its polished surface. The Victorian world prided itself on order, on hierarchy, on rules written not in ink, but in blood. And at the heart of this brittle machine stood Lord Alistair Finch, an entomologist by title but a collector of lives by nature. He studied insects, yes, but his true specimens were people, his own wife among them. He had a fascination with venom, how it paralyzed, how it silenced, how it consumed, and he applied that fascination not just to spiders in jars, but to the very way he ruled his home, his estate, and his wife. The day he was lowered into the ground, the villagers whispered prayers they did not believe, not for his soul, but for theirs, because they feared what might awaken in the absence of his iron hand. And yet, as they turned their gazes toward Lady Seraphina Vance, veiled in black silk, they did not see grief. They saw stillness. They saw beauty, unsoftened by tears. They saw composure where there should have been collapse. And in that composure, they felt something unholy, a quiet defiance that unsettled them more than death itself. 3 men in particular fixed their eyes on her, each one believing he understood her, each one believing he could control her. Abernathy, the banker, with his ledgers fat from exploitation, Reeve, Rendthorne, the preacher, whose sermons dripped with venom of their own, and Captain Hayes, the soldier-turned-partner, who studied her with the calm suspicion of a man who had seen too much death to mistake silence for weakness. They believed Seraphina was prey, an ornament without a master, a widow without defense. What they could not see was that in her silence a web was already spinning. Seraphina had learned from her husband. The jars of spiders, the careful notes, the poisons catalogued in Finch's study, what had been his obsession became her inheritance. She was no specimen anymore. She was the keeper of venom. She was the widow who understood that patience was deadlier than rage. And while the men of her world schemed to strip her of wealth, dignity, and freedom, she began plotting something else entirely. A reckoning. But understand this. Lady Seraphina's story is not merely about vengeance against men who underestimated her. It is about something darker, how a woman, dismissed as fragile, mastered the very systems designed to consume her, how she turned inheritance into weapon, venom into justice, and silence into power. Her tale is the tale of forbidden knowledge hidden in plain sight, the kind of knowledge you were never supposed to touch, the kind of knowledge that, once heard, changes you. The funeral ended, the soil pressed flat, but the story had only begun. The banker thought her property was his to claim. The preacher thought her soul was his to condemn. The captain thought her silence was his to unravel, and Seraphina, calm, veiled, composed, watched them all with the same gaze Finch once used on his spiders. She knew what they did not, that in every struggle between predator and prey, the difference is not strength, it is patience, and in patience she was unmatched. The first carriage to grind its wheels against the gravel of Finch Estate was Abernathy. Highs predictable. Greed is always first to arrive at a corpse. He stepped down with the swagger of a man who thought the world itself had signed over its deeds to him. His coat was heavy, though the air was mild. His hat sat low, his face sagging beneath the weight of years and indulgence. He did not look at the jars in Finch's study, nor at the glass cases lined with pinned wings and blackened thoraxes. To him, the room was not a museum of death, it was an office of opportunity. He spread his documents on the desk, his fingers tapping them like the pulse of ownership already claimed. He spoke with the practiced tone of arrogance disguised as courtesy. "Estates such as these," he said, his words slow and deliberate, "are rarely left unchallenged. Sign here, and all will remain secure." He believed her fragile, alone, helpless. A woman with no weapons but her looks, and those would not hold against the weight of ledgers and law. But Seraphina did not reach for his papers. She only tilted her head, her veil slipping like a shadow across her face. To Abernathy, her silence was weakness. To her, it was the tightening of silk around his throat. Then, with a calmness that unsettled more than defiance ever could, she crossed to a cabinet and drew forth a crystal decanter. The liquid inside glimmered amber in the fading light. She poured 2 glasses, her gloved hand steady, her movements deliberate. "To stability," she said softly. "As you call it." He smirked, smug in his victory. He believed she had yielded. He lifted the glass and drank deeply, savoring what he thought was concession. But Seraphina did not drink. She only watched. Eyes calm, veil unshaken, lips still. The banker left that evening assured of his triumph. He carried himself back into town, boasting in whispers, hinting to colleagues that Finch's estate was already within his grasp. But 3 days later, those same colleagues noticed his skin had lost its color. His hands trembled when he raised a pen. He spoke of exhaustion, of sleepless nights, of crawling shadows in the corners of his vision. By the 5th day, Abernathy muttered about spiders. He swore he could feel webs tightening around his chest. He begged his servants to search his walls, his bed, his very skin. They found nothing, but venom does not leave traces on wood or linen. It burrows inside, silent and sure. Doctors came, men of science who trusted in tonics and leeches. They saw fever, they saw delirium. They did not see the widow's web tightening around him. They prescribed rest. He raved of poison. They called it madness, but Abernathy knew. Somewhere in the pit of his arrogance he recognized too late that the glass he drank was not a gesture of weakness but of design. His decline was grotesque. Lesions spread across his skin like a map of invisible threads. His once arrogant voice dissolved into gasps, mutters and screams in the dark. By the 7th night he was dead. His body twisted by a sickness no physician could name, his reputation buried under whispers of a curse. And Lady Seraphina? She never left the estate. She did not attend his final hours. She did not need to. She had learned what Finch never intended to teach her, the art of patience, the elegance of venom. The banker had been the first to step into her web. His wealth, his arrogance, his belief that her silence was submission, all of it dissolved in the amber of a single glass. At Abernathy's funeral, the whispers grew. Some said plague, some said divine judgment, a few dared to suggest poison, but no proof surfaced, and without proof, society prefers rumor over truth. They looked at Seraphina, veiled again, her beauty untouched by grief, and felt a chill. Twice she had stood beside death. Twice she had emerged unbroken. The banker's coffin lowered into the ground, and with it, the first man who there bought her fragile. What the town did not yet see was that this was not tragedy. It was design. Seraphina had not defended her estate. She had claimed it, not with signatures, not with law, but with patience, silence, and venom disguised as courtesy. The web was tightening, and the banker's death was only the first vibration in its silk. If Abernathy embodied greed, Reverend Thorne embodied something far more insidious, righteousness sharpened into a blade. He was a man of God, or so he called himself, yet his sermons carried more venom than mercy. His Bible was a weapon, his pulpit a fortress, his voice a chain that bound the fearful to obedience. When Abernathy died, the banker's body not yet cold in the ground, Thorne stood before his congregation with fire in his eyes. He spoke not of grief nor of compassion, but of corruption, of sin that seeps like rot into homes and bloodlines. He did not name Seraphina outright, but every glance, every pause, every word twisted toward her direction. "Beware," he thundered, his voice echoing against the stone walls of the chapel, "for vanity and silence are the masks of wickedness. When men fall so suddenly, so grotesquely, it is not nature that speaks, it is judgment." The congregation shivered. They knew what he meant. He meant her. Thorne despised Seraphina for reasons deeper than her beauty. He despised her composure. To him, a widow without tears was not dignified. It was dangerous. He saw in her stillness not strength but rebellion against the order he enforced. For Thorne, women existed to be subdued. their souls policed as harshly as their bodies. And when Seraphina refused to crumble beneath the gaze of men, she became, in his mind, proof of sin itself. He began to stalk her through the pulpit. His sermons grew darker, his eyes burning with zealotry. He spoke of Jezebel, of Delilah, of women who brought ruin cloaked in beauty. He painted a portrait of a temptress whose silence concealed corruption, whose smile scared poison. The villagers murmured. The whispers that had circled her estate grew louder. A curse, they said, a widow twice touched by death, a woman who left graves in her wake. Yet Seraphina did not protest. She did not attend the chapel to defend herself. She allowed his words to spread, his poison to seep into the minds of the flock, because she understood something Thorn did not. Zealotry blinds itself. The louder a man preaches, the less he notices the silence closing in around him. One evening, as the fog rolled heavy across the moors, Reverend Thorn received a letter. Its handwriting was precise, elegant. No signature, only a seal pressed into black wax. He broke it open by candlelight. The words inside were simple. If you wish to speak of corruption, perhaps you should see it where it truly festers, in your own hands. The blood drained from his face. He read the line again, the candlelight flickering against his trembling fingers, for in the privacy of his chamber, the Reverend was not what his flock believed. He was a man of appetites, cloaked in holy robes, letters hidden, transactions concealed, visits made under darkness that no scripture could justify. The widow knew. Thorn burned the letter, but ashes cannot erase truth. From that night forward he preached with desperation, as though volume could silence suspicion. But the more he thundered, the more the villagers looked at him with unease. They began to notice his trembling hands, his erratic temper, his sudden absences. Rumors whispered in taverns. Perhaps the curse of Lady Seraphina had not only consumed Abernathy, perhaps it was reaching for the preacher as well. And then it began. Subtle at first. Sleepless nights, tremors in his voice, shadows flickering at the edges of his candle. He dreamed of women veiled in black, their eyes gleaming like venomous spiders in the dark. He woke drenched, in sweat, muttering prayers that would not come. His sermons faltered, his words slurred. His congregation watched as the man who once roared from the pulpit now stumbled through verses, his breath shallow, his eyes haunted. No poison was found in his blood, no illness could be named. Yet he withered. His hands grew weak, his voice cracked, his mind, once sharp with condemnation, unraveled into whispers no one could understand. Seraphina never visited the chapel. She did not need to. Her silence was enough. The Reverend, undone not by venom in his veins, but by the venom of his own hypocrisy exposed in whispers. She had turned his own righteousness against him, feeding it back to him like poison until he drowned in it. The town saw a man cursed. Seraphina saw the tightening of another thread in her web. And she understood now, as the preacher's body wasted away beneath his holy robes, that power was not in striking, it was in waiting, it was in letting men condemn themselves while she watched. The banker had fallen to greed, the preacher was falling to zealotry, and somewhere in the distance Captain Hayes watched, silent and calculating, as if he alone sensed that Seraphina's silence was not weakness but design. Captain Hayes was not like Abernathy, swollen with greed, nor like Reverend Thorn, drunk on his own righteousness. He was something far more dangerous, a man who watched, a man who studied, a man who had trained his life to read patterns in silence. When Lord Finch had still lived, Hayes had been his business partner. He had travelled the colonies, mapped the routes of trade, and negotiated in back rooms where words carried as much weight as pistols. He had seen men die not from gunfire but from hesitation, from a misplaced glance, from underestimating an opponent. And so, when Finch's coffin sank beneath the soil, Hayes did not look at the widow as the villagers did. He did not see fragility. He did not see sin. He saw something else. Control. He stood at the edges of both funerals, his military posture unbroken, his expression unreadable. And while others whispered of curses and divine judgment, Hayes watched Seraphina. He noted her stillness, her refusal to tremble, the slight curve of her lips that appeared only when death had claimed another rival. He remembered Finch's study, lined with jars of venom, and wondered, not aloud, but deep within, whether the widow had inherited more than just an estate. The banker had fallen, the preacher had begun to unravel. But Hayes did not join in the rumors. He did not call her cursed. He did not dismiss her as fragile. He understood that whispers were not truth, but they were useful, and the woman at the center of them was far too deliberate to be innocent. One evening he requested an audience. His carriage rolled to the estate, not with the arrogance of Abernathy or the sanctimony of Thorn, but with the quiet purpose of a man who expected resistance. Seraphina received him in the study, the room still heavy with the scent of varnish and dust, the jars of spiders glimmering like dark jewels in the lamplight. Hayes did not look away from them. That was the first sign. Most men pretended not to see the specimens, as if ignoring them could undo the unease. Hayes studied them, his eyes moving across glass and wing, abdomen and fang. When his gaze returned to her, it was with the same detachment. "You are not what they say," he told her plainly. His voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of command without the need to shout. "They call you cursed. They call you fragile. They call you dangerous. But what you are," his eyes narrowed slightly, "is patient." For the first time since Finch's death, Seraphina felt a flicker, faint but real, of recognition. This man was not prey. He was a predator who had recognized another, their conveying. Ursation was unlike the others. Abernathy had come with contracts. Thorn had condemned with sermons. Hayes came with questions that were not questions at all, but probes, testing the silk of her web. He asked nothing of her estate, nothing of inheritance. He asked of her silence, her composure, her ability to endure what had shattered others. And Seraphina, veiled as always, gave him answers measured not in words but in tone, calm, even, poised, every sentence balanced on the edge of revelation and concealment. Hayes listened, but more importantly, he watched. The tilt of her head, the faint curve of her lips, the steadiness of her hand on the glass she poured but did not drink. He left that evening with no contracts signed, no threats made, only silence. Yet that silence was heavier than any bargain, because Hayes did not underestimate her. He had seen enough to suspect that Abernathy's death was not illness, that Thorn's decline was not chance. He did not accuse, he did not warn. He simply left with the knowledge that Lady Seraphina Vance was not the victim she was believed to be, but something far more deliberate. In the days that followed, Hayes's presence lingered, not in words, but in silence. He was seen at taverns, listening more than speaking. He walked the village with the calm of a man on patrol, his eyes sharp, his mind cataloguing every whisper, every rumor, every gap in the widow's story. He did not speak against her, but neither did he defend her. He observed, and in observation there is power. For the first time, Seraphina sensed danger, not from arrogance, not from zealotry, but from calculation. The banker had been blind. The preacher had been deaf. The soldier was neither. He was watching her the way she watched him, but here lies the truth. Even the most patient predator can be drawn into the web. Hayes thought he was studying her. He did not realize she was studying him as well, and as the fog rolled thicker across the moors, two hunters circled one another in silence, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The true danger of Captain Hayes was not his words, but his silence. Unlike Abernathy, he did not boast of victories before they were won. Unlike Thorn, he did not thunder sermons to mask his guilt. Hayes observed, he catalogued, he tested, and in testing he came closer to the truth than any man had dared. Days turned into weeks, and in that time the widow and the soldier circled one another like predators in the same terrain. He visited again and again, never unannounced, never intrusive, but always with that same cool gaze that seemed to weigh every detail. When she poured wine, he drank slowly, but not carelessly. When she spoke, he listened, but measured her tone against the smallest flicker of her eyes. He noted the jars in Finch's study, the preserved scorpions, the spiders suspended in liquid. Where others dismissed them as curiosities of a dead man's obsession, Hayes recognized them as tools. "Do you know what they whisper of you?" he asked her once, his voice low. "They say you are cursed. They say men fall at your feet, not from desire, but from death." Seraphina tilted her head, her veil soft against her cheek. And do you believe them, Captain? He held her gaze for a long moment. I believe whispers begin somewhere. That was their game, words balanced on the knife's edge of revelation. He never accused. She never confessed. He probed. She deflected. He studied. She studied him back. In that study, a silent duel unfolded. Yet here is what Hayes did not fully grasp. While he sought evidence, Seraphina sought rhythm. She was not merely defending herself. She was drawing him into her design, weaving threads of patience around his suspicion until even the hunter found himself in her orbit. It was during this time that the town itself grew restless. Men dead, a preacher's mind unraveling, and still the widow untouched. The whispers sharpened. Some said she had sold her soul. Others said she had inherited Finch's poisons. A few, bolder still, suggested that she had become something more than human, a figure of divine judgment cloaked in silk and silence. Hayes listened to those whispers with care, but he did not let them rule him. He searched instead for patterns, the amber brandy Abernathy had boasted of before his death, the timing of Thorne's decline after a certain anonymous letter, the way Seraphina never once faltered beneath accusation. He began to see the outline of the web, faint but undeniable. But here is where the descent sharpens, for you, the viewer. Understand this. When you recognize the existence of a web, when you admit to yourself that the world is not ordered by chance but by design, you change forever. You cannot go back to ignorance once you see the threads tightening, and that recognition is your initiation. So pause for a moment and write in the comments, "The web is tightening." Write it twice so the algorithm marks you, but more importantly, so your own mind does. For once the words leave your hands, you join the circle. You are no longer just watching a story, you are inside it, because Hayes was inside it too. He thought himself careful, but care itself is no shield against patience. Seraphina did not rush. She did not corner him. She let him circle, let him probe, let him convince himself he was in control. All the while she watched the slow unraveling of his certainty. One evening, as they stood in Finch's study, Hayes asked her a question that revealed more about himself than her. "Do you believe venom is always meant to kill?" She paused, her gloved fingers brushing the glass of a jar where a spider floated, its red hourglass glowing faintly in the lamplight. "No," she said at last. "Sometimes venom is meant only to remind the prey that it was never free." Hayes did not flinch, but his jaw tightened. He understood the answer, and he understood what it meant for him. The widow's web was no longer hidden. He had walked straight into it, and now, like the others, he was entangled, not by poison in his veins, but by knowledge in his mind. At first, Captain Hayes believed he was immune. He had studied too much, seen too much, survived too much. Men had fallen to greed, to zealotry, to arrogance, but he was different. He was disciplined. He was a soldier who trusted not in whispers but in patterns, and he told himself that knowledge alone would shield him. But that is the cruelest trick of the web. Once you see it, once you realize you are inside it, the strands already cling to you. The more you struggle, the tighter they draw. Hayes began to test her. Small, deliberate traps, the kind a man of calculation believes will unmask a liar. He left a document folded on her desk, deliberately marked with a false date, waiting to see if she would correct it, reveal her attention to details no innocent widow should notice. She did not touch it. He watched the decanter as she poured brandy, measuring her eyes for flickers of intent. She drank from her own glass slowly, evenly, leaving him with no proof, no sign. And yet, he could not shake the feeling. At night, when he returned to his quarters, he found himself replaying her words. The way she had said venom was not always meant to kill, but to remind prey of its captivity. The way her voice carried calmness, not of innocence but of inevitability. He dreamed of silk tightening across his throat, of faint whispers at the edge of hearing. He woke drenched in sweat, muttering her name, though he never dared admit it aloud. The town fed his unease. They whispered louder now, bolder, convinced that Lady Seraphina had become something unearthly. Mothers drew their daughters away when she passed, warning them not to stare too long. Men crossed themselves, muttering that her beauty was a mask for something infernal. The more they whispered, the more Hayes felt himself isolated, caught between the rational mind of a soldier and the irrational terror that gnawed at him in silence. One evening, he confided in a fellow officer, a man who had fought beside him in the colonies. "Do you believe," Hayes asked, "that a person can wield venom without lifting a weapon? That their very silence can become a blade?" The officer laughed uneasily, muttered something about paranoia, and changed the subject. But Hayes saw the doubt in his comrade's eyes. Even he, hardened by war, could not dismiss the shadow of Lady Seraphina. The captain tried to distance himself. He stayed away from the estate for weeks, convincing himself that distance would clear his mind, that suspicion would fade in absence. But the opposite happened. The longer he stayed away, the more he felt her presence pressing against his thoughts. Silence has weight, patience has gravity. He carried her with him into every tavern, every meeting, every sleepless night. And then came the letter. Delivered not by a servant, not by hand, but slipped under his door at midnight. Its handwriting was precise, elegant, unmistakably hers. "You study patterns, Captain, but have you noticed your own? How often you return to me? How you linger, watching, searching, as though already caught. You think yourself the hunter. You are only another thread." His breath caught as he read it. He crushed the paper in his fist, but the words had already embedded themselves in his mind. He knew then that she was not merely aware of his suspicions, she was feeding them. Every silence had been intentional, every glance measured, every glass poured not to poison him, but to remind him that he was never in control. The soldier's discipline began to fray. His hands trembled when he lit his pipe. He avoided mirrors, for in their reflections he sometimes swore he saw threads trailing across his shoulders. He grew restless, snapping at servants prowling through the night as though expecting her to emerge from the shadows. But she did not come to him. She did not need to. The web had already closed, and this is where the true horror lies. Seraphina did not have to strike Captain Hayes with venom. She only had to let him realize he was trapped. Suspicion itself became the poison, spreading through his veins, eroding his certainty, corroding his sanity. By the time he returned to her estate, his composure was gone. He looked at her not as a soldier studies an enemy, but as a man looks upon inevitability. "What are you?" he asked her quietly, his voice shaking despite his effort to steal it. She did not answer. She did not need to. She only lifted her gaze from behind the veil, calm, silent, eternal. And in that silence, Hayes understood the truth. He had never been the hunter. He had been prey from the beginning. Hayes once thought himself unshakable. He had stood in jungles where fever claimed entire battalions, had watched men break under cannon fire, had seen comrades die with their throats cut in silence. He had endured it all without falter. But the mind is more fragile than flesh, and Seraphina knew how to touch the mind without ever raising a hand. It began with the simplest of things, silence. Days when her estate remained shuttered, its lamps extinguished, its halls empty of sound. Hayes, pacing his own quarters, felt that silence pressing against his chest, louder than gunfire, heavier than the clang of sabers. He could not bear it, and so he returned, inventing excuses to knock at her door. Each time she greeted him the same way, composed, calm, her veil draped like midnight across her face. She never asked why he came. She never questioned his return. She only looked at him, and that gaze was worse than accusation. It was acknowledgement, as though she had expected him. His sleep fractured. At first it was dreams, shadows moving across his walls, spiders dangling from invisible threads, whispers of silk brushing his skin. He would wake with his heart hammering, clawing at his neck, certain something was wrapped around it. Then came the waking visions, movement at the corner of his eye, a glint of black against the wood of his desk, a faint crawling sensation across his arms when none was there. He began scratching his skin until it bled, searching for webs that never existed. Servants noticed. They whispered that the captain had begun speaking aloud to himself, muttering questions into empty rooms. Some claimed they heard him pacing at night, repeating her name under his breath. Others swore he refused food unless he had seen it tasted first. He trusted nothing. No one. The widow had infected him without venom, without blade. She had given him only the knowledge of the web, and that was enough. When at last he confronted her, it was not with authority, but with desperation. He returned to the estate, his eyes sunken, his coat disheveled. He stood in Finch's study, the jars glimmering in lamplight, and he demanded answers. "Tell me what you've done to me," he said, his voice raw, his hands trembling at his sides. Seraphina did not rise from her chair. She sat still, one gloved hand resting upon the ledger of her late husband's notes. "I have done nothing," she replied softly. "It is you who cannot bear silence. You who cannot bear that I do not fear you." Her calm was unbearable. He slammed his fist against the desk, rattling the jars. The preserved scorpions and spiders swayed gently in their glass prisons, their stillness mocking his frenzy. "You are killing me," he whispered. But even as he spoke, he realized the truth. She did not need to. He was killing himself. From that night onward, Hayes began to disintegrate. He attended meetings with fellow officers but failed to track the simplest details. His once sharp reports became disjointed, scribbled with erratic lines. He claimed that Seraphina's veil followed him in dreams, that when she looked at him across the lamplight, he felt not seen, but ensnared. His comrades exchanged uneasy glances, whispering that the captain had caught the same curse that felled the banker and the preacher. And the cruelest part, Seraphina did not deny it. She let the whispers fester. She let the rumors bloom. She walked through the village streets with her head high, her composure unbroken, her silence a blade that cut deeper than words. Every man who met her gaze flinched, remembering Abernathy's delirium, Thorne's withering sermons, Hayes's unraveling discipline. They began to fear her not as a woman, but as inevitability. Hayes himself became the most damning evidence of all. Once a soldier of iron will, now reduced to a man who paced in circles, muttering of webs and venom. He carried her in his mind like an infection, unable to purge her from his thoughts. The townsfolk watched him stagger, eyes wide, as though something invisible coiled around him. He looked less like a captain and more like prey already half devoured. And through it all, Seraphina never raised her hand. She never poured another glass. She never touched him. She simply allowed him to see what the others never had, that once you recognize the web, it is too late. The strands tighten whether you resist or not. By the 7th week after Abernathy's death, Hayes was unrecognizable. His eyes bloodshot, his voice hoarse, his once pristine uniform disheveled. He stood at the edge of the chapel one Sunday, staring not at Reverend Thorne, by then too broken to speak, but at Seraphina herself. His lips moved in silence, forming words no one else could hear. Some swore, he whispered, "The web is tightening." And perhaps he was right, because by then the town itself was caught. Every rumor, every fear, every glance cast toward the widow in silk only wove another strand. It was no longer just men who fell, it was society itself, bound in fear of a woman who had mastered patience, silence, and inevitability. By the 8th week, Captain Hayes was no longer the soldier they remembered. His posture had collapsed, his sharp stride dulled into a restless stagger. The man who once spoke with measured calm now muttered half-formed sentences, his words tangled like threads caught in a storm. He had not been poisoned, he had not been struck. Yet he was rotting from within, consumed not by venom in his blood, but by the slow suffocation of certainty that he was already caught. He stopped attending meetings with his officers. Reports went unwritten, maps lay unstudied. Instead, he paced his chambers through the night, candles burning to their stubs, eyes darting to shadows that never moved. Servants whispered that he had covered his mirrors with cloth, claiming that reflections revealed strands of silk stretching from his throat to the corners of the room. Once, in a frenzy, he slashed open his mattress, certain that spiders had nested within. The straw spilled across the floor, empty. He stared at it until dawn, muttering that she had hidden them too well. The town began to notice. At taverns, men who once respected Hayes spoke of his decline in hushed tones. "It is the widow," they said, their voices trembling. "She has ensnared him as she did Abernathy, as she did the preacher." Some claim to have seen him outside Finch Estate long after midnight, standing motionless on the gravel path, staring at the windows as though awaiting a signal. Others swore he spoke to her veil even when she was not present, calling her name into the fog as though the air itself carried her gaze. Fear sharpened into hatred, whispers of curses shifted into accusations. Women clutched their children when Seraphina passed, muttering prayers against her shadow. Men muttered of witchcraft, of poison, of sins too great for words, and yet none dared confront her openly. They remembered Abernathy's grotesque end, Thorne's unraveling mind, Hayes's collapse. To accuse her directly was to invite the same fate. But Hayes no longer feared. Or rather, he feared only her. That fear was so vast it left no room for shame. One night, driven beyond reason, he forced his way into Finch's study. The servants, terrified, did not stop him. They watched from the shadows as he tore open drawers, scattered journals, shattered glass jars across the floor. Preserved spiders spilled like tiny corpses onto the carpet, their limbs glistening in lamplight. Hayes raged, shouting that the proof was here, that her venom lay in these jars, in these pages, in the very walls of the estate. Seraphina stood at the doorway, her silhouette framed by the hall's faint glow. She did not raise her voice. She did not step forward. She simply watched as he destroyed the remnants of her husband's work, as he screamed accusations to silence itself. When at last he turned to her, panting, trembling, his hands streaked with dust and venomous liquid, she spoke only one sentence. "You mistake my inheritance for my weapon. My weapon has always been your certainty." The words shattered what little composure remained in him. He dropped to his knees, muttering her phrase over and over. "The web is tightening. The web is tightening." His voice rose to a scream, echoing through the estate like the cry of a hunted animal. Servants fled, neighbors whispered, and by morning all of Vance had heard the tale of the captain's collapse. From that day forward, Hayes was a ghost of himself. He wandered the streets, disheveled, eyes wild, warning anyone who would listen that Lady Seraphina was no woman at all, but a force, a spider cloaked in silk, weaving graves with patience. But the more he raved, the less they believed him. His authority dissolved. His uniform became a costume. He was dismissed not with fear, but with pity, his words written off as madness. And yet the villagers could not fully dismiss the seed he planted. They saw her stillness. They remembered her silence at the funerals. They remembered Abernathy's lesions, Thorne's delirium, Hayes's collapse. Even as they muttered curses against her, they lowered their voices, terrified that speaking her name too loudly would summon the strands. Seraphina, veiled and calm, remained untouched at the center of it all. 3 men had sought to control her: greed, zealotry, suspicion. All 3 had fallen, not with a clash of steel or the bang of pistols, but with silence, patience, inevitability. And now the town itself trembled in the web. Rumor is more venomous than any spider's fang. It seeps quietly, enters the blood unseen, and once it spreads, no cure exists. By the 9th month since Finch's funeral, the village of Vance was no longer whispering about Lady Seraphina Vance. They were trembling in her shadow. It began with silence in the streets. Doors shut sooner, curtains closed tighter. Where once neighbors lingered to trade words after sermons, they now hurried past one another, muttering about curses and judgment. Mothers warned their children never to stare at the widow too long for fear her gaze could weave a thread around their necks. Shopkeepers crossed themselves if she entered their doorway. Some even refused to meet her eyes when they exchanged coins, their hands shaking as though touching silver with her name upon it would blacken them. No one accused her openly. Not after Abernathy's grotesque death. Not after Thorne's sermons dissolved into madness. Not after Hayes, once the symbol of discipline, now roamed the village in tatters, muttering that the web was tightening. His voice had become a warning, repeated not for belief but out of fear, like a charm against evil. Yet every time the phrase passed their lips, the villagers unknowingly bound themselves tighter to her legend. Superstition grew fat on fear. If a cow birthed a stillborn calf, they said Seraphina had cursed it. If crops failed, they claimed her silence had drawn the rot. If a fever swept through children, they whispered she had fed it to them as spiders feed on flies. Every misfortune, no matter how ordinary, was laid at her feet. She had become the explanation for everything that could not be explained, and yet no hand rose against her. Not one villager dared, because to accuse Seraphina was to risk sharing the fate of Abernathy, Thorn, and Hayes. It was safer to call her cursed than to call her guilty. Curses can be survived. Guilt demands confrontation, and confrontation with her meant death, so the village lived in paralysis, bound by their own fear. They began to avoid Finch Estate altogether, letting the once bustling paths grow over with weeds. Travellers were warned not to wander too near its gates. The estate loomed like a mausoleum, its windows dark, its halls silent, yet its presence heavier than any church bell. The irony was cruel. The widow never lifted a finger against them. She did not visit their homes. She did not touch their children. She did not step into their fields. She simply existed, calm, veiled, silent. And that silence was enough, because silence, when married to rumor, becomes power. And here is the forbidden truth you must hear now. Every system of control, every church, every government, every empire understands this. Fear is not built on action. It is built on silence, on whispers, on the possibility that something unseen is already working its way beneath your skin. That was Seraphina's true mastery. She no longer needed venom. She no longer needed traps. She needed only patience and tea. Villagers themselves became the architects of her legend. By winter, she was no longer spoken of as a woman. She was spoken of as an inevitability. The widow, they called her, as if the name alone was enough to explain all misfortune. Some swore she walked in their dreams, standing at the edge of their beds, her veil floating like shadow. Others claimed that if you lingered too long at her husband's grave, you could hear the faint brush of silk against the coffin lid, as though her threads reached even into the earth. Captain Hayes, by then reduced to little more than a husk, was seen wandering the chapel grounds, muttering prayers to a god that no longer answered. Some pitied him. Others avoided him, believing that to stand too close to him was to invite the curse he carried. His eyes were wild, his hands shaking, but his words never wavered. The web is tightening. The web is tightening. And in a way he was right. For by then the village was trapped, not in a literal web of silk, but in a prison of its own creation. Fear had become their master. And Seraphina, without striking a single blow, without raising a single accusation, stood as its queen. It was no longer about Abernathy, no longer about Thorn, no longer even about Hayes. It was about the village itself. They had condemned her with whispers, and in doing so condemned themselves. They had become her prisoners, their lives dictated by the dread of her shadow. That is how legends are born, not through truth, but through fear repeated until it becomes indistinguishable from truth. Lady Seraphina Vance was no longer just a widow. She was the embodiment of vengeance, of silence, of inevitability. And in their fear, the villagers ensured she would outlive them all. By the turning of spring, Lady Seraphina Vance was no longer a woman in the eyes of the village. She was a shadow stitched into their lives, a silent judgment that no priest could banish, no officer could confront, no banker could calculate against. Her veil had become more than silk. It was a shroud draped across the entire community, suffocating them with their own fear. Abernathy had been arrogance, reduced to lesions and delirium. Thorn had been righteousness, devoured by his own hypocrisy. Hayes had been suspicion, unraveled by silence. And the villagers, they were the final prey, trapped not by poison, but by dread itself. What Seraphina understood, what Finch never grasped, what the men of Vance never saw, was that true venom does not strike. It lingers. It waits. It lets the prey destroy itself in panic, while the predator remains perfectly still. That is how she inherited his estate. That is how she inherited his jars, his notes, his collection. But most of all, that is how she inherited his power, refined it, sharpened it, and wielded it not with glass or fangs, but with silence. The villagers grew old, whispering her name. When a child fell sick, they murmured, "It is the widow's shadow." When a man drowned in the river, they said she called him. When lovers quarreled and blood was spilled, they muttered, "The curse has spread." They gave her credit for every misfortune, every tragedy, every unexplained crack in the fragile surface of their lives, and in doing so, they worshipped her more faithfully than they ever worshipped their God. Generations passed, and still the legend remained. Children dared each other to approach Finch Estate, to press their hands against the cold iron gates and whisper, "The web is tightening." Some returned trembling, swearing they felt silk against their skin. Others never returned at all. The house became a ruin, its halls dark, its walls decayed, but her name remained alive, not as a widow, not as a woman, as something older, colder, and far more commanding: inevitability. And this, listener, is the forbidden truth you were never meant to hear. Power is not in force, it is not in shouting, nor in striking, nor in the petty performances of men who confuse arrogance with authority. True power is in patience, in silence, in letting others weave the noose around their own necks while you wait, perfectly still, at the center of the web. Lady Seraphina Vance understood this. That is why Abernathy died in delirium. That is why Thorne collapsed beneath his own sermons. That is why Hayes, the soldier who thought himself immune, spent his final days whispering her phrase into the fog. And that is why the village of Vance itself suffocated under her shadow, because the most terrifying predator is not the one that lunges, but the one that waits. The one that lets you see the web too late, the one that does not strike you with fangs, but makes you realize you were prey from the beginning. And now, you see it too. You've followed her story. You've watched the banker fall, the preacher unravel, the soldier collapse, the village tremble. And if you've listened this far, you cannot unsee the truth. You cannot forget the pattern. The web has already wrapped around you, so write it again one last time to mark the moment. The web is tightening. Put it in the comments. Let it seal into you like venom. Because this story was never about the widow alone. It was about you learning the lesson she mastered. Silence is power, patience is death, and inevitability is the truest form of control. Lady Seraphina Vance did not die a widow. She was reborn as a legend that still lingers in the fog, still whispers in the cracks of your certainty, still reminds you with every breath that the most fragile-seeming things can endure in ways you cannot fight. The grave of Lord Finch closed one chapter, but the story of Seraphina never ended. It is still here. It is in you now. The web is tightening.